The ICF Training and Technical Assistance Team is honored to welcome you to this California Housing and Community Development Training Session offered through the Emergency Solution Grants Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. I'm Chris Pitcher from ICF, and I'll be hosting today's session. Today's training session is part of our community workshop series and is entitled Low Barrier Emergency Shelter. It's my privilege to hand it to our first presenter, Tom Albanese. Tom?
Great. Thank you, Chris. And good morning, everyone. It's nice to see everyone. Those of you on camera, those of you off camera, feel free to turn your camera on if you're so inclined, but don't feel like you have to. It's just nice to see faces. And happy Friday and happy Good Friday, if that's what you're celebrating. Nice to see folks. And welcome to our conversation today around low barrier shelter. Just by way of quick introductions, I'm going to introduce myself and let Mindy and Jean introduce themselves, but just I know we might have met in prior sessions, but I'm Tom Albanese, a consultant working with ICF and the team in California. I'm actually based in Columbus, Ohio, and I'm a licensed social worker. I share that because I really reflect on my social worker ethics and values as I do my work every day. I know most of us, if you're a licensed social worker, or even if you're not, many of us are doing that. And I would like to mention that because it's sort of part of my fabric. And I've spent a lot of time both in direct service and working at systems level in Columbus and elsewhere around the country. So I'll hand it off to Jean to introduce yourself. Jean?
Yes, thanks, Tom. Hello, everyone. I see some familiar names as well as some new folks to me, at least. My name is Jean Field. I work with Homebase. We're a technical assistance firm. My colleague Mindy is here as well. I'll let her introduce herself. I'm based in San Francisco and have done a lot of work around California. And it's really great to see you all here because I know how much work you're out doing every day and today as well. Mindy?
Thanks, Jean. Hey, everybody, it's Mindy from Homebase. I probably have seen a lot of you on a lot of different webinars that we've done as part of this work. And I'll say again, I love doing the emergency shelter work because, as a lot of you know, I started this whole journey as a case manager in a very high barrier shelter for families. So this, like Tom said, has a lot of meaning for me. And I'm coming to you today from Baltimore.
Yeah.
Oh, and this is my assistant, Ella.
I am not airplanes. I will do. I visit airplanes home thinking time. I kind of them. I will not software. I really don't like the noises.
Thank you, Ella.
Yay, Ella. Thank you, Ella, for being with
Thanks,
us.
y'all.
Thanks, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Jean and Mindy, for being my partners in this conversation, and really want to thank everyone for joining us. Use the chat to raise your hand or raise your voice. Please use this chat now to just introduce yourselves. We don't have time to go around the entire room here. And we're going to do our best to keep this loose and to answer questions as we go. Mindy and Jean and I have some things to share, but we really want to hear from you too. We know this is an ongoing conversation and a daily focus of pretty much everyone here, I'm sure. So let's move to the next slide. And just quickly, our agenda today, we've kind of outlined it. We're going to talk just for a moment about grounding our work in equity, really centering everything we do around the concept of equity and what that means in practice. We'll talk a little bit about what low barrier means, what are some of the keys to low barrier, and then we really want to engage in conversation. And we're going to ask you to talk with your colleagues, your peers here, about some of the challenges around implementing low barrier shelter and to surface those back up with the full group, and we'll have a group conversation around some of those common challenges, and together, like, put our collective brain power, to work. And then we'll conclude by just talking a little bit about how to sort of bake equity into our culture, our fabric, and our daily work in terms of information gathering, data gathering, and using that in really practical ways to just continue our work forward. So we'll wrap it up with that, have some Q&A, and then we'll be done. We are going to keep this to an hour and a half. So good news, not 2 hours. We are going to wrap it up at 10:30, right? Do I have, no, 11:30, sorry, Pacific, I'm Eastern. So we're going to do a quick poll. We just want to know who's in the room. Take a moment. Ask Kristen to please, there you go, call up the poll, take a moment, just identify your role. We like to get a sense of kind of your background, what you currently do relative to operating shelter, interim housing, temporary housing, and the like. All right, I see some folks haven't responded yet. Take a moment. We'll give you another 10 seconds. Identify your current role. Okay, I think we've got almost everyone. Let's go ahead and end the poll. It looks like I'm trying to share the results. Well, okay, I'm not sure if I'm sharing, but Kristen, if you could share the results, or Mindy. It looks like we have a lot of program managers here, a handful of direct service folks, housing navigators, and a mishmash of others. Part of the reason we wanted to know that too, and then we'll move on, is I learned from my friends at Sheltering Arms in New York City the importance of everyone having a role in providing a welcoming, affirming environment, and one that helps people move forward. And what I learned from Sheltering Arms was the importance of training and readiness by even the folks who are taking care of the building, because that might be the person that somebody connects with that day, right? So I just wanted to kind of draw that out. Everyone here is important in this conversation, no matter where you sit in your program, your agency, and your community. So let's move on to the next slide. Very quickly, just around equity. Again, I'm a social worker, whatever your vocation, however you come at this work, or perhaps directly through your own experience, and recognizing that in this work, we do have a fundamental ethical responsibility to serve everyone who is experiencing a housing crisis, who is unhoused or facing literal homelessness, sliding toward it. That's sort of why we're in this work. And so we have this ethical obligation to do that. But when we think about what that translates into, it's really important to consider our ethical obligation also means we assure people have equitable access, quality services, and equitable outcomes in the services they receive. So it's not just like an abstract, ethical responsibility. What does that mean? It really means very concrete things, how we provide and make known how somebody in a crisis who may not be thinking very clearly because, you're in a crisis, right? How to access shelter. How can we make that as easy as possible? How can we make sure when people do try to access shelter, they're not turned away for reasons that have nothing to do with their housing emergency? And don't cause any concern for imminent health or safety reasons. So how do we make sure we're otherwise able to accommodate everybody and then help them quickly move toward housing in a dignified, humane, supportive, affirming, non-traumatizing, and ideally housing-like environment as possible, right? So it's normative. That's what crisis intervention does. It normalizes as quickly as possible to move people out of the crisis and reduce the trauma that's caused by the stress and the and those experiences. So we learned through the pandemic that the safest place that people need before, during, after the pandemic is safe, stable housing. Ideally, again, that's independent, that's certainly affirming. And what we've learned as well is that we don't need to consider like the urgency of our response as somehow being in conflict with providing an equitable response, or one that's more accommodating and that can meet people where they're at. That's really our obligation. And that means we have to have the resources, the staffing, the training, and the partnerships to do that. We may not be there today. And this is what we want to talk about with you all, is how do we get there? We realize sometimes to be as low barrier as possible means you might need a bigger training budget. You might need to pay people better. You might need better partnerships. You might need some protocol to help people get to the right place if suddenly your place is not the right place, or vice versa, right? How do we build that so we have a community-wide process that and system that makes sure no one is on the street for want of a safe, affirming place to stay. So that's, and we really build this, and I think I'm having been in work a long time, very motivated every time I listen to people. And so we're going to share with you in a moment some of the feedback that we've just quickly gathered, and surely you all have, many of you have done this as well, that help to inform, inspire, and motivate this work around lowering barrier and really making shelter welcoming, non-traumatizing place. So we're going to share some of that as well. But let's move to the next slide. And I'm going to pass it off to Jean.
Great, thanks, Tom. And we're going to talk a little bit about what are some of the core principles of low barrier shelter. And I think as Tom said, basically low barrier also means high supports. When you lower barriers, meaning you're accepting people where they are, often in a state of crisis and trauma, we need to have more supports for them as well as your staff, because those frontline folks need to have the tools, the training, and their own emotional support to deal with people who are in a very severe state of crisis, because that's what unsheltered homelessness is. It's a traumatic experience. So shelters can provide a respite from some of that trauma by providing a safe and quality safe sleeping area. But we know that they need to do more. And with appropriate resources, we know you are doing more. Every single shelter is. We need to have them lead to appropriate treatments and housing so that people can make that safe transition to their next step. We think the key principles and practices are very important because they're pretty overview. This is not a one-size-fits-all endeavor. Each shelter is different, each person is different, each community is different. And so addressing each particular program and person is really key. But keeping in mind some of the key principles, it is crisis-oriented. As Tom said, there is a sense of urgency in terms of meeting people's needs. Some of the key practices that people should bring to that crisis are good practices around trauma-informed care, which means educating your staff, and that's everyone who's ever on site, so that they understand how people react when they're in a state of trauma. Very quick example, sometimes we hear of people who come into shelter and then won't speak to anyone for a week. They won't, what we call, engage. That is a symptom of trauma. They are trying to recoup from a very traumatic experience. Sometimes another type of training is crisis recognition, crisis safety, de-escalation, so that staff people have the tools to appropriately and safely work with folks who are in that crisis. We also, mental health first aid is another very crisis and trauma-centered approach, meaning giving staff and peer support people the tools to understand how to appropriately engage people who may be in a crisis, a mental health crisis. And so a lot of those trainings can be provided by community partners. And in building that partnership with training, so for example, a lot of hospitals and fire departments will have crisis response training. And you can build further kinds of supports with those community partners. Another thing that we really encourage folks to learn how to do is to understand some basic principles of motivational interviewing and connections to community resources. That does not mean that every case manager, every shelter intake worker needs to do everything or needs to do it all. But giving them the supports and the linkages to those community resources and people who can support them is very important. Right? The other key principle and practice is people-oriented. As I said, very person-centered, equitable approaches. One person may come in with a very different set of needs and abilities and goals than another person, and allowing time and the ability to get to know that person's goals and resources and build a strengths-based practice around them is very important. It's not a one-size checklist fits all. I'm going to run you through a checklist and what are you going to do today? What are you going to do tomorrow? Here are the goals you need to meet. It's working and engaging with each person that comes to the door to find out what their best path to stability and housing might be. And housing-oriented, housing-focused practices. Every step of the way, should be geared to finding housing for folks. And we know in California, that is the hardest part, right? That does not mean that your shelter needs to be a landlord or needs to have access to all the housing. But what it does mean is working with your continuum of care, your housing authority, your VA, your other partners within the community to understand what kind of housing pathways exist in your community, what you can help people at the shelter do to prepare to engage with those other systems is very important. And so housing focused is, again, an individualized approach. And it's a housing first, a housing second, a housing third type of situation. Getting a job for the sake of getting a job is not the way you do that. Getting a job, if that's a person's goal, is how are we going to make sure that that job leads to the next step as well, right? We have too many people in shelters with jobs at this point in our state of California. So helping people make that step. So next slide. One of the things that Tom mentioned and we think is really important is listening to the folks who have been in shelter. And I'd like to just take a little bit of like 30 seconds. And if you can think of any feedback that you've gotten from somebody at a shelter or one of the participants in your program about what worked for them in shelter, you could just take a step back and think about that. Great. And so hold that in mind and see if some of these ring true for you. Understanding that one person's journey is not another person's journey, very clearly. It doesn't matter, but there are some things that we have heard over and over from folks when we go out and do focus groups, surveys, talking to people, some hallmarks of what really does work for folks when they're being sheltered. So we've highlighted some information from a 2022 study from the National Coalition for the Homelessness, and it was a very equity-based listening sessions. They did 7 listening sessions with 33 participants in 17 cities in the District of Columbia, and it was a very diverse group, predominantly people of color in these groups. And I want to say that this is a national survey, but I know my colleagues and I at Home Base have done many of these kinds of listening groups in California as well. Specifically, we did surveys at every Home Key project, Home Key Round 1 in California. And as you know, some of those were interim sites, some were permanent, some were interim to permanent. And the findings are very, very similar. Next slide. What respondents overwhelmingly concerned about safety and service delivery, because one of the most primal things that people are being traumatized by when they're on the street, right, is safety. They're sleeping with one or both eyes open, if they're sleeping at all, every night. And so in shelter, if that sense of danger continues, that is not going to be a safe space for people to begin resolving other issues that they may bring. And participants have unanimously supported the need for that kind of safety, but also to access to services. One focus group that, a couple of focus groups that I did within the Home Key systems had very different ideas of what safety meant. For some of them, it meant making sure that there was a locking gate with residents having their own keys. For others, it meant having an on-site manager so that they could call and get the services, or if there was somebody at the site in precarious health, that's something that meant. But overwhelmingly, we know that congregate shelters provide less of that sense of security and safety, right? So thinking about how are you getting feedback from folks at your shelter, no matter what the setup, congregate, non-congregate, scattered site. So trying to think about how you're responding to people's needs for safety and services. Next slide. I would say that we all know one of the good things that came out of the COVID crisis was a recognition and a scaling up of hotel and motel shelter settings, that those have been an overwhelming success. Every participant that I've surveyed and the participants in this studies who stayed in a hotel were very grateful for the hotel setting. Having their own key was one of the biggest pluses. Privacy, showers, some had access to refrigerators or even maybe a hot plate. Those were all the amenities that made people feel like they had a safe and secure place to begin to stabilize and set their goals from. Opportunity to meet case managers was also a very positive element of hotel participants. One of the things that I have heard, though, is that sometimes that wasn't robust enough. Sometimes they weren't sure how to access case managers for next steps. So making sure that's very clear to participants, because when you do have participants spread out over a wider area in their own rooms, sometimes communication styles have to change as well. Whereas maybe before you could put a bulletin on the front door, here everyone has their own front door. How are you communicating some of the basic things about your program to participants? Next slide. What hasn't worked well? Room sharing between individuals who do not know each other. I would agree that that is a very difficult situation. We all know that it's difficult to share space with others. And certainly it is very difficult when you're coming in from a crisis, you're experiencing a crisis, all emotions and frustrations and irritations are escalated at that point. And that does not increase that sense of safety that we talked about when you're sharing space with a stranger. Absence of staff and difficulty in coordination with staff. On-site, even if there is an on-site staff member, that on-site staff may be a security guard or somebody who's just really doesn't have access to the full range of information that they need to support people at that site. So thinking very intentionally about how staff are available to participants is important. As programming matured in this study, staffing concerns got better. And I think hopefully that is a result of feedback and understanding, how are we serving the folks that we have in our program? And I think one of the things that many operators of non-congregate shelter especially have been frustrated by is when people transition back to homelessness. And that is the key thing to avoid, right? You've given people this respite. What is the next step? They don't want to go back to the street, 100%. And how are we going to support them, especially people who have the highest needs? What kind of other resources can we bring to bear? And how can we transition when maybe a temporary site is closing? Next slide. So I think that the takeaways, as I said in the beginning, is we need to listen to the people in our programs and think about what made it work for that person that you were envisioning that had some successes, and what could you do for the folks that maybe haven't been as successful. And I would add to this in listening to your frontline staff as well. What frustrations are they having? Where are they feeling that they're not adequately trained or supported by the education and experiences that they bring, by their colleagues, by the other resources they have available? Incorporating staff and client suggestions is very key to improving these programs. The bare minimum, safe, sanitary, secure spaces, right? And we would add, I think, in the low barrier context, the P's, right? What about people's pets? What about their possessions? What about their partners? Those are sometimes the most important things that can make a safe and a safe space for people. And tailoring case management as well as all other services to support individual needs and their successful move to permanent housing. And I think those are the takeaways that across this study and many of the other groups that we've talked to are really key to lowering your barriers and increasing your supports. And I think, Tom, you're up again.
No, it's off
It's
over
me
to
this
Mindy.
time.
All Mindy now. All right.
Yes. Thanks, Jean. And thanks for sharing the data from that really important survey. Before you guys came on, we were talking about the piece that I'm about to talk about. When I was working at the National Alliance to End Homelessness, it was feedback and surveys from consumers that directly shaped the 5 keys to emergency shelter that you guys might have heard about. So this was based on a lot of surveys that happened with people who were unsheltered or staying in emergency shelter, and really meant to kind of inform what is kind of a common sense approach, but a lot of times we just need to keep kind of revisiting and touching back to these points. So the first key, as with all of this, is that we are taking a housing first approach. So sometimes it can be kind of hard to conceptualize housing first in the concept of shelter, because shelter is not itself permanent housing, right? But it's about that kind of philosophy about housing first. So we're really thinking about our what are our shelter eligibility rules, criteria, policies, practices. All of those are kind of fitting within that housing first philosophy. And that is really rooted in the solution to homelessness is housing, right? Housed people are not homeless. So we're always coming from that basic space and then building everything else around it. The next key for emergency shelter is safe and appropriate diversion. We won't have enough time to really talk about anything like diversion today, but it's just really keeping in mind that when we can avoid bringing people into the homelessness system altogether, that is the best for them and the best for our community. It's just really, that's a way of centering housing, right? It's not a denial of service, but it's making sure that we're giving people the services that they need without them having to go through the inevitable trauma of entering the homelessness system itself, right? As great as we are, actually becoming homeless is itself a trauma that we can avoid if we build our diversion system out really well. The one that we'll spend the time today talking about is, of course, immediate and low barrier access. This can, for logistical reasons and also just pragmatic reasons, can be a difficult one to make happen. In reality, in real time, a thing that I think about a lot, especially since I used to work in policy, it's really easy to kind of envision these things in a big theoretical way, but you know, where the rubber hits the road and you have to do this in real time, what does that look like? One of the ways that you guys have probably heard me talk about this is where we come up with those individual problems. It's when we're building out our policies and procedures, we have some kind of baseline that is like the in the case of being low barrier, and also what that means about who comes in might create some issues for who might need to be exited, right? And so there was a really great transitional housing program at the time, which is no longer transitional housing, but when they changed to become a housing first program, they were just like, our baseline is we don't exit anybody into homelessness. So there are lots of things that might happen where somebody can't be in this program anymore because of safety reasons. But what we won't do is exit them into homelessness. What did that look like? It changed, as Jean said, with each individual case, but having that boundary that they would not cross caused them to have to be creative in problem solving this. Well, if this is not an option, how are we going to do this other thing, right? And I really love that. And for me, that's kind of an ethos that's part of this low barrier access conversation, because inevitably safety stuff does come up. The next key, housing focused, rapid exit services. So like Jean and Tom both talked about, like this is about housing, making sure that we're able to do everything that we can and devote our energies to having those conversations about how do we get you back into your own housing? What does that look like for you? And making all of those conversations about that. Our shelter, especially now that we have become a non-congregate shelter, possibly, like we're doing more to make shelters places that people do want to go when they're in a crisis. But we also want to make sure that we're thinking about, hey, how do we get you out into your own housing too? Like what needs to happen to make that happen? And then finally, and this is a really important piece for thinking about how we're doing shelter equitably, is making sure that we're looking at our data. So depending on the community that you're in, some shelters in your community may or may not be a part of HMIS. Some shelters in your community may or may not be a part of coordinated entry. So depending on what your data looks like, even if they're not, there have been some faith-based shelters that haven't been a part of any of those formal government systems that have gone through trainings to be able to look at their own data and find out who's coming into shelter, who's going out of shelter, how long are people staying, where are they exiting to, who's coming back to shelter, right? So really looking at that and then putting an equity lens on it as well too, to see if any of those data points have inequitable implications in them as well.
Mindy, can I add two things really quick? I dropped something
Sure.
in the chat. It merits a little bit of explanation because you made this
Oh, please
excellent
do,
point.
please do. I can't see
made
the
this-
chat from where I am.
Yeah, you made this excellent point about, sometimes we have to work in concert with other options, right? To make sure people don't fall to the street. That's kind of our fundamental obligation. And the recovery housing brief that HUD put out about 10 years ago now, a little bit less, actually speaks to this concept in a really interesting way relative to sobriety-based housing. So not quite like, shelters
Right.
specifically. So it's a good reference. And then the other thing I would just add, your point about looking at your data, can I just share, like, this is Jermaine, in Columbus, the system I've worked in for around 10 years total now, not currently, but most recently when I was working in the Columbus system, we looked at service restriction data from shelters. And I want to put a fine point on this, because this is, if you're not looking at your data, you really need to. In Columbus, they track shelter service restrictions. It's trackable in the data system. It's an open data system. We analyzed it. And guess what we found? We found disproportionate application of service restrictions on people of color, specifically our African-American and Black clients. And that was deeply troubling. And it was one reason we made a wholesale examination of our shelter restrictions. We got rid of them. There were no more restrictions unless it's imminent health or safety, or somebody's actually going to get harmed, right? So, Mindy, to your point.
Yeah. And I think those are always, you guys have heard me talk on other webinars about different topics, but where data is concerned and where equity is concerned, you have a data point and you ask questions then and you say, what's going on there? And there are lots of different things probably going on there, and whatever the what's going on there response is, there's then a action to take based on that response. So there's also a why, right, Tom? So if you think about what the usual service restrictions are, criminal backgrounds, right, is one that immediately comes to mind. Because of the structural racism that leads into disproportionate contact with law enforcement and disproportionate convictions and disproportionate jail and prison time, right? That's inevitably going to mean that disproportionately you're going to have more people of color who meet that service restriction and don't get to come in for that reason, right? So I think those are really important for being able to have those conversations, but then have really thoughtful, why is this happening? What does it mean? And then what do we do about it? So another performance measure that I mentioned when we talked about this key was one of the things that we saw in some of the data analysis that we did for a lot of different shelters around the country was that even where places didn't have disproportionality coming in, or disproportionality in stays, or even disproportionality in exits to housing, where they did have was disproportionality in returns to homelessness, right? So then you ask that question, what's going on here, right? And there might be a lot of different things. If it's just one shelter that's showing this, it might be that one case manager, and then we need to have some, like training for this particular case manager. But it might also be landlord discrimination, right? It might also be that we haven't done enough work in our case management to ensure that there are good social and community supports for clients of color, right? So I think this one, which sometimes data can be really boring, but I think in the shelter context, particularly because it is a crisis and things are happening fast and people are in and out, being able to figure out a way to at least grab a little bit of that information so we do know what's going on is really, really important for equity and just performance in general and getting folks back into housing. Thanks, Tom. And you guys it's hard to see the chat when I'm doing this thing too, so feel free to interrupt me.
Not seeing anything.
Okay. So what do we mean when we're talking about low barrier practices? We're talking about high access, letting folks in and being equitable about it, right? So thinking about kind of how we conceptualize what we're doing when we have a low barrier shelter. We have all been guilty of saying it this way, like moving from these are hard to serve clients, these are harder to serve clients, to they're just harder for us to know how to serve them. And again, I came from a case management shelter background. I totally lived this stuff. There were some folks that were just, I knew instinctively how to serve them. It was easier for me to understand what to do. And then there were other clients, it was just, I had a really hard time figuring out what to do, right? So reframing it that way. A really important one when you're thinking about that housing first approach, even if it's not explicitly about permanent housing right now, what that philosophical approach is about moving from people need to be ready for housing before we move them into housing, right? Yeah. Ella hissed at that one. We don't do ready for housing. People are ready for housing by virtue of not having any. And that is the core philosophical approach of housing first, and our whole system, the shelters, all of it needs to be coming from that place. So some examples here when we're thinking about access, you're really looking at what are your criteria for getting in? What are those restrictions? Is there anything in place that is stopping you from having same night access after you do your housing problem solving conversation, your diversion efforts? What's stopping it from happening? And again, it may not be anything nefarious on anybody's part. It's probably coming from a place where we're like, we thought we were doing something that was about safety and being pragmatic. Or one of the really fun examples from some of the emergency shelter work that I have done is what ended up being called the Marvin Rule. Tom, have you heard about this? You know, there was a shelter that just had a rule about no caps inside the shelter. Why? Because Marvin wore a cap one time 20 years ago, and in it he had a razor blade, and therefore no caps, right? Or no lighters, right? Because one time there was this one guy, his name is inevitably Marvin in these examples, who brought a lighter in, and he went in the bathroom and was engaging in some substances, and something caught on fire. That was a Marvin issue. It wasn't a shelter problem issue, right? So when you go and you make a rule for just one person and that one person's behavior, it has this effect on everybody else who comes in. And what we know from looking at the data and really thinking about this, that effect is probably going to disproportionately impact people of color, right? So that's really important. Asking that question of yourselves, walk yourselves through it. I show up at the shelter. What's going to stop me from coming in tonight? Really walk through it. What are your hours? Where are you located? How are folks getting to you? Are there ways in place to help folks who don't have immediate walkable or bus access to get to you? Those 3 Ps, people, partners, pets, possessions, sorry. A really, really fun project that I worked on was something with PetSmart, to the PetSmart Foundation, to really do in-depth studies on people who are experiencing homelessness with their pets and shelters who have made the shift to become pet friendly. There was a lot of pragmatic stuff people had to think through. There are safety concerns inevitably. It's always a possibility when you have a pet that your pet might bite someone or scratch someone, and you have to think through all of that stuff. But just because you have to think through it, just because it's hard for us to know how to do it, doesn't mean it's impossible to do, and doesn't mean that it won't give us dividends when we do it, right? Really thinking about when you're thinking about designing access to your shelter is, how do I do this in a way that reduces people's stress? They're already in a really stressful situation. Are you being a good kitty? Oh, thank you. How do you make sure that people aren't re-traumatized during the whole process? How do you not burden folks? This is inevitable in bureaucracies, but God, you guys think about it. How many times do you interact with some system, Comcast, your water company, where you're like, is all of this really necessary? People are thinking the same things when they have to do a whole bunch of forms and present a whole bunch of documents just to get what they should have by basic right, which is a safe place to stay tonight, right? So additionally, you're being inviting and affirming at access, during intake, in the common and the private areas. You guys have heard me say this before too. It's just about good customer service, right? Like just thinking about it that way. Same thing with your service delivery, the quality of your services. With our non-congregate shelters, we're thinking about making the spaces that we have humane, dignified, non-traumatizing, making sure that the supports that we're providing and the skills that are required are those. Being very individualized, being person-centered, coordinating services and rehousing as you're having those housing-focused conversations and you're thinking about rapid exits from shelters. You're always doing that in that individualized approach. Again, good customer service. And finally, where outcomes are concerned, we really want to restrict how many involuntary exits that we have. Again, think about that awesome transitional housing program and that boundary that they have. Even if we have involuntary exits, we have a boundary that we will not cross, and that's involuntarily exiting someone back into homelessness, right? At the same time, minimize involuntary exits as much as possible. So when you do have good data too, you can look at your involuntary exits and have a conversation. Why were all of these? Do we see any patterns there? If they were clearly about safety concerns, okay, that makes sense. But then what can we do better on the front end to reduce the safety? Maybe we need a lot more de-escalation training, right? So thinking it through like that, let's not just assume about everything that we have in place, even if we have the best shelter in the whole wide world, that we can't still do some stuff to improve. Really thinking about when we're completely banning people from shelter, why we're doing that, really having that analysis. That also inevitably in our communities probably has some disproportionate impact on people of color.
And can I add one thing on that?
Yeah,
Mindy,
go ahead.
Quick. I just have to say this, which I think just to acknowledge that we, I think from a provider, I've been a shelter provider, I've operated shelter, I've been on those front lines. And, it's often thought of as like, okay, one way we can motivate somebody is by involuntarily exiting them. And then maybe we'll restrict them from shelter for a week or a month or what have you. And maybe they just violated rules. They didn't come back from curfew. And they're a real pain in the ass because they're not even following curfew. Like, what am I going to do with this person? I guess we should just exit them and maybe they'll learn because we'll restrict them from shelter for a while. So that logic, I just have to say, doesn't change behavior.
Yeah.
There's not any evidence that suggests that changes behavior. It's actually traumatizing.
Right.
And we have an obligation to figure out some other approach to engage people in sometimes hard conversations. I'm going to admit it. Like, as you said, Mindy, I don't pretend to have all the answers either. This is really tough work. People are hard to know how to engage sometimes and how to have a conversation where they can not just nod their head and say, yes, I will, but actually feel as though they're empowered to do something and they can do something that they can actually do. And in a moment, it's easy to say yes when you're really stressed out. It's easy to say yes.
Yeah.
So.
It always strikes me too, when we have these conversations, as listening to you, Tom, I'm like, anybody who ever tried those approaches with a teenager, they don't work. And also that brings up another thing that's kind of one of the things I really love about Housing First, the philosophy is, again, as awesome as we all are at this job, there is inevitably a power differential, right? You are unhoused and I am usually, not always, but I am housed. I am in a position of authority. I literally have the power to say, you come inside, you stay outside, right? And it's really paternalistic as well, kind of conceptualizing things that way. So good reminder that not only does this not work, we all know where it comes from, right? Like we all have people in our families and our social circles that frustrate us in all the same ways. But particularly when we're doing this work, there's an extra obligation to get it right, to not be paternalistic, and to really think about, is what I'm doing actually helping? Is what I'm doing getting me more towards helping this person be not homeless? When you're taking that approach, it almost certainly isn't, right? Finally here, just those safeguards, all of this is in place when you're thinking about your coordinated entry system. Each of these are kind of places where barriers can be for stopping folks from getting into shelter, right? And each of these, if there is a barrier there, it's likely having a disproportionate impact on people of color who are experiencing homelessness. Okay, this is the last part for me. I'm not going to read a whole bunch of this, but for those of you who are on and who don't know, HCD has adopted a policy that will govern your emergency shelter activities when they are funded through ESG and ESGCV. So there's a link here, and I think one of my colleagues will make sure that that goes in the chat. And a really important part is the section about terminating folks from shelter and making sure that there is an appeals process. So you do have to have a termination and appeals policy if you're going to be doing ESG, ESGCV shelter, right? So this is required for all of the projects that are HCD projects and for HUD projects. There are requirements for terminating assistance that are in the Code of Federal Regulations. You have to have a provision that you're only going to terminate in the most severe cases. So it is creating that boundary and sticking to it, really thinking through what that looks like. And then, of course, got to comply with all of the other mandates that are in your contract documents and ESG written standards and COC written standards. At the same time that I'm telling you all of this, I will freely admit, as a lawyer and as a person who is just generally frustrated with all the bureaucracy, this in itself creates more bureaucracy. So maybe it'll be on us one day to figure out how to make all of this happen without all of these layers of standards. And then finally, you have to detail the steps that you're going to take to make sure that anyone who's terminated doesn't return to unsheltered. So again, that early adopter of that really great approach, this is now part of what's required of you. And I think it's a really good problem-solving conversation to have as a shelter, as a community, about what that looks like. There is somebody who, for safety reasons, almost certainly will be the one thing, can't stay here anymore. What do we do? Right? That's a really, really great conversation, a really fruitful conversation. And as always, an equitable conversation, right? Yes. Okay, I think this one's back to Jean.
Great. Well, just briefly, Mindy was talking about the rules. And as we know, the rules, as Mindy went in, the rules should be practical, should be focused on behavior, not individuals, right? And one of the things that we can do to make those rules work for your staff is to go through a cycle of, let's evaluate them. Let's weed out the Marvin rules. Let's weed in some of the rules that are there to support our staff and our clients. And I think this is a really great chart. I'm sure most of you know that there's a lot of very highly paid consultants, of which I am not one, that are specialized in change management. And they have all sorts of like fancy proprietary like databases and charts. But at the root of all of those kinds of change management is this simple process. And it's basically, take a look at your rules. Like what incidents are happening now that we don't think are good, and how can we avoid them? That may not be another rule. That may be shifting around our cafeteria structure. That may be shifting around our entryway. That may be staggering entry and exit times. Whatever it is, wherever you're finding points of conflict, let's talk about what those rules say about that and how we can do things differently. Recognize all the things that are, going wrong or right, and meet with your staff and clients and get their perspective on it. Maybe a client will say, we'd have a lot less people coming in angry if we had 3 people checking people in, so we didn't have to have them all in the same entryway when they're tired, they're cold, they're hungry, and they hate each other, right? So let's, find a different way to do that. Listen to those suggestions. Review the rules and your procedures and processes and see if you can make a change, right? And so that's another one. So let's go through it, eliminate or change something. Eliminate a rule that's unnecessary, change a procedure that's not working, and see how it works, right? And then ensure that the rules that you have, the policies and procedures you have are very streamlined to making things work for the people who are staying at your shelter and the staff who are supporting them, right? And for those basic rules, and for basic rules, I mean maybe like codes of conduct at the shelter. There shouldn't be more than 10 or so, some basic safety rules. Post them so people know what they are. Talk to clients, hold frequent meetings with staff and clients, and talk to them about why the rules exist. They have a really great example, and this was a number of years ago, but it was a domestic violence survivor shelter, and it was an emergency shelter. And so, of course, they were very concerned about the safety of the people who were coming there because they were typically actively fleeing abusers, right? And it was an anonymous shelter. And they used to have a rule where everyone had to check in all their electronic devices, cell phones, computers, and that they couldn't use them. Because what they were afraid of is they were afraid of contacting people who would come to the shelter, who would spread the address, who would cause danger. It was a safety consideration, right? But the staff and clients met and talked about how that was putting folks at a disadvantage for making doctor's appointments, getting jobs, everything that you need phones and computers for doing. And so they decide, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. But for every person who enters the shelter, we're going to sit down and we're going to have a meeting about why we used to have this rule, what the rule was intended to secure, which is we need this to be a safe and anonymous space, and give that responsibility to our clients and staff. They have never had one single incident since they dropped the rule about cell phones. And the staff talked about what a revelation it was to them to be able to put trust into their clients through explaining the reasons behind the rules. Now that is, a pretty unique situation, I think, but in general, talking to clients and staff and saying, we want to be able to have these are our safety rules. You can't threaten each other. You can't, this is a basic safety behavior. And talking about how, what that means to the facility and designing the facility to minimize any opportunity for that rule to be broken ever is the way to institute new rules and policies. And I'm just going to give on the flip side, the way not to do it. The way not to do it is to write maybe a 10-page document of very complicated rules that nobody ever looks at again. And then people get in trouble for violating. So, it's much better to talk about those rules and put them into place. And if they're not working, guess what you do? You change them. You try something new, but you do that with your clients and your staff and your directors. I think. Next slide. I think that's on.
Yeah, I'm going to do that one. But Jean, that made me think about something, which is every policy. There are some policies, national level, state, local, whatever. Every policy probably comes from a decent place of wanting to solve a problem, wanting to fix something. You have to be willing to say, first of all, why, and explain to people why this policy exists, and then say, is there another least restrictive, less restrictive way to achieve that outcome without this policy? If there is, we should by all means lower the restrictions, but you also have to have a conversation about unintended consequences. And I think the example that you gave about the domestic violence shelter is a really great one for, we may think we can come up with unintended consequences on our own, but the people who know what the unintended consequences are the ones who are on the receiving end of
I know
that
is.
policy,
I know that
right?
is.
I know you do.
If
So, okay.
if you
Great. So I think Tom and I are going to give you the intro to the breakout groups, but we really want you to talk about the things that we've been talking about, because we know it's not that easy. And that there are some challenges, but there are also a lot of success stories out there. So we're going to break you out into groups, and we want you to share a time when you, your program, or your community struggled with implementing one of these 5 keys to effective shelter. And again, the housing first approach, the safe and appropriate diversion, meaning finding other pathways for folks that for whatever reason aren't going to make it inside the shelter, immediate low barrier access to the shelter and housing focused rapid exit services, and trying to use data to figure out what you're doing right, wrong, and who you're serving and who you're not serving. So what are some of the things, how did implementing some of these play out in your program and community? What we're going to do.
Jean, I'll just add, since we've got about 10 folks or so, let's just do 2 groups. Is that okay, Kristen? Just let's split up folks in 2 groups. We're just
I've got 2 groups set up for you.
Awesome. Just have a quick conversation, as Jean said, and we'll, what do you think, Jean? Maybe 10 minutes or so, given our time?
Sounds fantastic. I'm looking forward to what people say.
Awesome. Click on the join breakout room, and we'll see you all in 10 minutes.
Kristen, you set a 10-minute timer for them?
No, but I will.
I got it. It's 1:08 or 2:08 my time. I'm tracking.
Chris, are you
Sorry.
going to keep recording on now, or are you going to turn it off and then turn it back on?
Is this you, Tom, or?
I think it's Jean, but it's okay. I think we're kind of tag teaming it anyway. So why don't we go to the next slide? And welcome back, everyone. I know we kind of tapered down a little bit in terms of numbers. It is a Friday, but we appreciate everyone hanging on. We hope you had some interesting conversation. We really just want to hear from you. So, we just had 2 groups. Can I ask somebody from, oh gosh, we probably should have identified somebody in that first group, but in the group, I'll say this, the group that Hal, I recall your name that you were in, could somebody from that group maybe give a quick report out? What did you talk about? What did you learn? And if somebody's talking, you're on mute. But I know that group, Hal Nolan, I think you were in that group. Do you want to share maybe? I'm just calling the first person I saw in that group. Use the chat as well.
Yeah, apologies for that. I'm
worries.
the only one here today, so I'm kind of doing a little bit of everything. And
Oh, wow.
I think Ricky and I were the only ones who actually talked in our group, but
That's right.
we kind of walked into that not really knowing what to talk about. Because we're kind of the same thing as far as just bouncing back and forth with things that we're trying to get done and trying to, obviously stay focused on what we're doing here. But we discussed a little bit about, what our programs and what our reach is in our community. But other than that, we really didn't talk about anything else.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm just curious how, Ricky, what, just like out of curiosity and given our topic today, what is if you were to say as far as like your shelter program, your operations, like the biggest challenge for you today, like currently, like what's like your biggest struggle in terms of trying to keep people under roof or get them under roof?
Well, I could say for here, we're in Mariposa County. We're the only shelter in Mariposa County.
Yeah.
We've only been open since 2019, the end of 2019. So I call us the baby of the bunch when it comes to this factor. But and I think it's the same thing. I don't care who you talk to, where you're at, but of course, it's just finding housing. The affordable housing in our area has been little to none, being that we're the backyard to Yosemite.
Mhm.
Everything's being transferred over from being a rental to vacation rentals because that's where the money is at. Obviously,
Yeah.
housing costs alone have just exploded exponentially over the last years. I mean, I've been in this community now over 20 plus years, and we've seen rents that were, a 3-bedroom home that used to be go for, $800 to $1,200 now at close to $3,000. Well, if you're selling your property, to be able to make a buck, obviously because of the prices, everything that's gone through the roof, the new owner, how could they afford to rent that for that dollar amount? They really can't. So these things are being, rented out for what, the value and the cost is of it. But sadly, when you have the demographic that we have here, a lot of elderly, a lot of fixed income, a lot of, the working poor, they simply cannot afford those types of prices. So we're essentially pricing individuals out of our county. It's kind of sad to see that, but without the other affordable housing opportunities, we really don't have much of an option of either they stay here long term, we have to move them out of county. If there is some, transitional housing available, essentially there's 3 houses in our county with 2 to 3 beds each that availability is at. Few and far between when they open up. So anyways, I think the struggle is real pretty much anywhere you're at. It's just we're really seeing a great deal of that here locally.
How does that, I'm curious though, like, and I hear you like on this affordable housing crisis is, I'm in Columbus, right, Ohio, but it's what you just described, and I work with small counties around Ohio, same dynamic. It's really actually the same. Price points are a little bit differently, but cost of living is a little bit different too. So all in all, the dynamics is fundamentally the same. I think the interesting thing though is like, how does that play out in terms of who you can serve? You kind of alluded to this, Hal. I'm just curious, and then we can hear from others too. It sounds like you said you either have to help people move up, out of county, a transitional place, but maybe they just end up staying longer, which I suspect means your shelter gets bottlenecked, right? Is that how that plays out? You're unable to offer shelter to folks because you're kind of full up.
Yeah, if you're the end all be all and there's really literally nowhere for people to go, and you're not going to be exiting people just because, right? I mean, we do have a 60-day length of stay policy here, which is incredibly flexible, right? The whole point behind that is not so much that, it's a definitive set deadline that you must find housing in 60 days or you leave. It's no, let's work towards getting into housing. And everybody's goal is going to be different. How they take that path is going to be different. As long as you're walking that path, we extend that 60 days. So it encourages people to be empowered in their abilities to get back into housing, regardless of if there is housing.
So and I'm sorry, Hal. I just want to throw this out there, and then I want to hear from others too. But your point about like you are trying to create some forward movement. You say 60 days is our goal, right? And there's some flexibility around that, but you're expecting progress. So I'll challenge the group. And maybe this is like part of what we should talk about is what is progress? And what does it look like when people aren't progressing? What do you do when it looks like people aren't progressing? What do you do when people aren't progressing because it looks like they're doing so when they have viable options? And what might be impeding their ability to move forward or affecting their choices, right? And so I'm wondering, and I'm not pressing you on that, Hal, at all. To just say I think it's a really good tension point, right? Because you're trying to get people moving on, as Mindy said earlier, or Jean perhaps. Sometimes we just have to sit down and talk with folks, and have a real conversation about like what shelter is and what it isn't. what do other folks think? And I want to kind of punt to the other group too, just to, we don't have to talk about that if there's something you dug into as well. Folks from the other group want to chime in? I'll just start calling on folks too, just to get your input. Nancy? Or Denise, I saw you come off mute. Denise, what were you going to say?
Thank you. Yeah, so this is Denise with Central Sierra. So Hal, hello, good morning. We had some technical difficulties in our group, but thank you for that question, because we're, as a community action, we do have 3 shelters in operation now. Thankfully, some of the HAP dollars did open another one in Amador County. So what we're finding is, well, of course, exactly what Hal just alluded to, that, you know, rapid rehousing is continually not so rapid. And it really, really strengthens the time frame that people stay in shelter with the multidisciplinary team concept. So after we receive the whole person care dollars for the newest shelter that we have, those conversations with Adult Protective Services, CPS, just all sorts of different other service providers really move folks through the system of care, and it creates a comfort level for them to be able to talk with more than just the shelter operators, but maybe some other service providers that make them feel comfortable about sharing their situation. So I would say it's the wraparound support, and that's, you know, it's challenging in rural regions, but we're getting there and we're doing better.
That's such a great point. Thank you for saying that. And I think in California, you're especially advantaged, frankly, from what I can see, because of the HAP dollars flowing like manna from heaven now, and other incentives that MCOs have through the HIP and other things, right? And it is bringing new resources to bear. And I love that example. Thanks for sharing that. When we bring everything we can, the whole community, into the shelter, we can help people move forward a lot faster and be better for it, because they're going to have connections well after the crisis. That's our job, right? So I love that point. What else came out either in that conversation, or just what are folks thinking about? Nancy, do you want to add?
I was actually late. I was in court, but I had to take a client to court. But I'm here. But I do want to just add a little bit to what the previous person was saying. Here at our shelter, we actually have what we call an event, like a link event, where we bring resources on site for all of our shelter clients and any other clients who are experiencing homelessness. So we do have like an eligibility worker, we have mental health, we have AOD counselors that come on site. We have employment connection coming on site. So it's different agencies coming on site just to make sure, you know, that services come here and provide that to our clients. And I've seen, like, it's so much easier. Like when we are trying to locate housing and getting them vouchers, it's a lot easier to have the eligibility worker here on site and getting them, you know, their birth certificate. So, you know, that's been a great help for us, opening those resources on site.
That's such a great example. Thanks, Nancy, for sharing that, because your point about bringing services to where people are sleeping every day and where they're feeding their kids and staying, like, can we just do that maybe? And we can, like, you're doing it, right? And I think this is where, you know, do we have more work to do? Sure, we always do. How can we bring our partners and the community resources right to where people are staying? And because I think you just said it. I'm not certainly don't want to repeat your words, Nancy, but I've seen that play out so many ways too, where if we can make it just more readily accessible, literally getting your docs, getting your benefits rolling, all those things you noted, we're going to see much better results. And it speaks to, I think, what Denise was sharing too. What others what else are folks thinking about how to bring in other resources, bring in other supports to make, you know, these keys kind of work for people, right? So we can be as maximally accommodating. Any other just good ideas, examples?
You know, going off of what Nancy just said is absolutely true. Is, you know, your community partners are going to be crucial to being able to provide services. Obviously, they have different funding streams that they can get that you cannot, and the other way around. So you definitely have to work with them. The other avenue you got to look at too is your community as a whole. Obviously there's a lot of stigma that's involved with the homeless communities. Sadly, a lot of our media point out just the absolute horribleness that they see around them, but not the good, and that each individual is different. Every path is different. So being that voice for those that don't have a voice really should be part of our conversations that we have with our community. Hit every resource that you can. Talk to your faith-based community members about being able to provide services as like food, for instance, paths to being able to get transportation. When you have things like, here's Easter coming up, what types of opportunities are available for individuals for that. Being able to have that outreach for your community to understand that we're not just talking about people that don't have a house. They have been through a lot of struggles. There's a lot of trauma involved. And we're talking about human beings, people. If you're going to give $1 to protect a puppy, why not a person?
Right. So true. Well, thank you, Hal, for that. And that's a great, I think, point for us to kind of move to the last part of the information we wanted to share. And then we want to open up just for some final, dialogue. So if we can go to the next slide just quickly, I will just say a couple things about how we might consider building equity into our programming going forward, and would really invite Jean and Mindy to weigh in here too. Part of it goes to our partnerships. We were just talking about this, right? How do we bring the community into the environment where people are staying temporarily, our interim housing settings, right? I think this is about building trust and safety and connectivity and community and so forth, right? All these things that are help to ameliorate, help to, get you through like the crisis, right? And then beyond. That's a really important feature, and having ways, as Jean said earlier, to make sure we can hear from folks all the time in ideally anonymous ways, so you feel safe giving your critical feedback or your positive feedback or whatever feedback you'd like to give, and you can do so in a way that allows people to express where they think there's room for improvement and what their experience has been. This really hits at all levels, right? Like to really, I think, build equity into our work and make sure we are. And I'll just say, I've been doing this for 30 years, and I learn every day something new about how I can learn, work with others differently, and continue to evolve, right, as a human being and in our practice. And I think that's the spirit here, is how do we sort of build that into the culture and the dynamics of our program. So we're always listening, we're looking at our data, we're looking at the impact of what we're doing as we kind of have already laid out. To go to the next slide, just quickly, talk about a few examples in terms of how we might go about, monitoring and looking at this. And some of this is repetitive, so I don't want to repeat the same points, but I'll highlight a few that we haven't really focused in on as much. Part of this is just like really looking at your data. And I'll just say my own experience in Columbus, it's important to, make sure you know the demographic makeup of your community, the community you're there to serve. And then, of course, looking at who comes into shelter and experiences homelessness, and where there's disproportionality, there should be a more scrutiny. And I'll say, when we look at disaggregated data, we see disproportionality, obviously in terms of racial characteristics, ethnic characteristics, but also in terms of disabling conditions. So I think how you said it, right? I mean, folks come in with a lot of issues sometimes. If you look at the data and you look at the prevalence of self-reported disabling conditions, most adults who experience literal homelessness report one or more conditions. In Sacramento, where I'm doing some work, they just one point in time count to another have moved from a plurality of adults reporting significant, severe, persistent disabling conditions to now a majority. In other words, it's tipped over 50% of adults. It's now at around 60% of adults, families and singles, reporting one or more significant disabling conditions. That's inequity. That's inequity. And that means we have a lot more work to do to bring equity and to even out, give folks that extra help they want and that they're asking for. Yeah, house, same thing, right? So that's just to call out like that importance of continuing to look. And of course, I think others to touch on this, we have an aging population too. That's going to change how we show up for people and what other partners we bring in. I hear and I certainly encourage as more and more partnerships with our departments and area agencies on aging and other partners in that space, right? And the examples I think that were shared about bringing in like adult protective services to those conversations, that whole person care. And then there's ways we can embed that into our cultural norms too, as far as we mentioned, just inviting feedback, really making it known, having those honest dialogues, as really scraping away the power dynamics as much as you can. Obviously, you're still going to have somebody who's there in need of something and somebody who's offering something, and that's inherently a power dynamic. But how can we minimize that by just being real people with folks and have a conversation about expectations, behavior-based expectations around codes and sort of working in commune with others and being safe together. So those are some examples. I'm just going to pause. And last thing I will say, and I've come to really appreciate this, looking at communities like Detroit and others who are really investing in inclusion by hiring people, not just one person, but a team of people who then can work across their system or within an agency to lift up, train up, hire up, and empower people who are using services, because they bring a different expertise and experience into that our work and really makes it a much better experience for everybody. So that's some thoughts. We've got a couple minutes, just a few minutes. If there are any questions or thoughts, we'd love to just hear from folks, or Jean and Mindy, anything else just to add. But please unmute yourself, chime in if you got a thought. It's Friday, yay.
I just want to say thanks. It was great to hear from Hal, Denise, and others that I've worked with. I know how much work you've put into your communities and how you've built up those resources. So just a lot of appreciation for everything that you do.
Absolutely. And these are some extra resources we wanted to just get in front of you. I believe the slides will be posted per usual. You should be able to access these links. This last example here, I do want to call out, as Jean was saying earlier, like when we listen to people, we learn new things. And this was a study that was done in King County around people who use non-congregate shelter and why that made them feel more safe, less traumatized, and actually they had better housing outcomes. So like it's like remarkable what happens when we treat people like people, right? And get over our own fears. And I'll say this, and maybe a concluding thought from Columbus, many years of feeling as though we can't offer people individualized rooms in hotels because, oh my God, what will they do behind a locked door at night? Oh my gosh, they might be people, right? And we literally couldn't, like, we were paralyzed by offering that. The pandemic taught us something different. It taught all of us something different, and that we should remember that people can be treated like people. It might cost more. We might have to do things differently. They're going to have better outcomes, and we'll all be better for it. I think we are at time. Chris, I'll let you lead us out.
Thanks, Tom and Mindy and Jean, and thank you for joining us on this Friday afternoon and attending the California Housing Community Development Training Session offered through the Emergency Solution Grant Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. When you leave the session today, there will be a 3-question survey that pops up. Please do fill that out. We look at those every single week and address training. So if you have additional trainings about this topic or other topics, please put that in there. We actually do listen. With that, enjoy your weekend. See y'all later.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks.